And so today's webinar hopefully gives you that sense of like how you can bring these qualities to life. We did get together in the summer last year to begin with, as part of the Human-Learning-Systems collaborative that we're all part of, and explored leadership in particular. We did a sense-making activity from across all the different examples of practice that had been submitted by organizations. And that's sort of what you see in the top right in that little circle there, is a little bit of how we were trying to make sense of everything. And this session is basically designed to give you a few ideas and insights about the leadership implications in human learning systems. We're therefore really grateful that Mike Crowther from Empowerment, Sally Kendrick, formerly from Plymouth Children's Service, and Diana Heckerham from the Healthcare Improvement Scotland are joining us. They've all been involved in HLS-informed programs and are very kindly sharing what they've been learning with us today. So Human Learning Systems offers a more meaningful way of putting relationships at the heart of public service and ensuring that the work we'll do supports human freedom and flourishing. But too often, public service leaders are trapped in this narrative around metrics, management, working in competition with and in separation from other organizations that could actually help make a difference collectively. So Human Learning Systems has very much developed from those inspiring and radically pragmatic pieces of work, projects, programs, led by people who decided to do things very differently and who determined that we need to design support around the citizens that we serve rather than expect people to fit into cookie cutter services. So you can now find more than 70 examples of HLS practice from across the UK and beyond on the HLS website. And they cover a whole range of different practice contexts as well, which is really amazing. And they really show amazing leadership qualities, like the ones you mentioned there in the chat, in terms of humility and curiosity, and being collaborative, building trust, and so on and so forth. So we're extremely excited that these are all there. Almost by definition, many of these examples of practice obviously reveal insights about leadership. For the purpose of our little research analysis, we've focused on 18 of those, which I mentioned here. And we'll send through the links to each of those afterwards as well, if you're interested. These ones are perhaps a little bit more explicitly about leadership implications of system change. And in addition to all of this, this webinar is also informed by our own respective work in the arena of leadership, which we're bringing to the table. So with that, I'd like to pass on to Lee.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Gabriel. So as Gabriel was just saying, we have brought our own kind of frameworks to this session, as well as drawing on the examples of practice from the organizations that were on the previous slide. Collaborate as a community interest company, and we run some leadership programs. We're also involved in the HLS collaborative. So that's kind of how we're coming to this session. And I'm going to give a little bit of introductory framing to lay the groundwork for the session. And together, Gabriel and I will talk through some of the applications of HLS in leadership, or vice versa, really the relationship between leadership and HLS. So for the purposes of this session, leadership is the practice of mobilizing change across boundaries to make progress on complex problems no organization can address alone, no individual can address alone. And so leadership, as we're defining it here, has to do with systems because of that emphasis on crossing boundaries. There's a kind of natural application to systems thinking. Also has to do with each other, with relationships, because we can't make change alone. It's about how we work together, how we impact on each other. And it also has to do with practice, more so than position. So being a practice of mobilizing change, it's more of an activity than a role as we see it, which is easier said than done because, of course, when we say that, we're sort of challenging a dominant mental model or mindset that says, specialized roles are the way to go. It's efficient to work in silos, and we should be managing and controlling for targets, even working in complexity. So it's kind of why it's important that we have these conversations about what we actually understand leadership to be. So if it's not a role, then we can lead from wherever we are, and leadership can take us beyond the scope of our the formal kind of positional authority that we may have in organizational contexts. So some will have attended one of the other events of this series about HLS and system stewardship. Others will be familiar with the concept of system stewardship. We can think about stewardship as one kind of leadership intervention. So if leadership is mobilizing change across boundaries, system stewardship is one manifestation of that. So leadership can include fostering purposeful understanding and connection to create conditions for healthier systems. It can include other things too. For example, kind of activism to bring those practices into existence at all. There's, of course, lots of overlap here in kind of seeing ourselves as part of systems and building relationships across boundaries, redistributing power, learning together. But the outcome of stewardship is more consistent, hopefully, from example to example in nurturing healthy conditions, whereas leadership could bring about lots of things. For example, could have the effect of drawing something to people's attention so that it gets addressed. Seeing oneself and one's organization as part of a system is something that the HLS community uses this illustration for of planetary bodies in a universe. And what this illustrates, I think, really helpfully, is that when we have an objective of improving people's lives, which are complex, we're one of these planets amongst others, combining and interacting to produce outcomes in someone's life as a complex system itself. And so in this sense, outcomes aren't delivered by organizations. They're kind of emergent properties of the interactions in a system. And we can't then contract anyone to deliver an outcome. So in the world of HLS, there's an understanding that contracting and kind of performance management for outcomes can hold people accountable for things that they, in fact, don't directly or completely control. So if we want to understand how to support an outcome, we need to understand and influence the system, which we understand to be about leadership, so that we don't end up like the people in the box, trying to get from A to B and ignoring the things that are going on outside that kind of constitute that complexity. So we're going to draw out some insights of our own and also draw on some of the examples of practice that connect leadership with HLS. And we're going to do that by human learning and systems. So I'm going to pass it back to Gabriel to introduce the connections that we're drawing between leadership and that human piece of HLS. And then I'll take us through the L and the S of learning and systems before we hear from our speakers.
Thanks, Lee. So in human learning systems, I think the human bit means very much that we put humanity and relationships at the heart of everything we do. And the examples of practice show that this is critical if we want to build trust, and that we can't really support human flourishing without putting relationships at the heart. We need to recognize the value of diversity and collaboration, especially with those who've been most marginalized, and where there is an erosion of trust. they've been most often let down by public service, for instance. So actually, systems leadership is about how can we do this together? It's a team game, and recognizing that other people's perspectives bring us new insights that we wouldn't otherwise be able to acquire. We need to show up with head, heart, and hands. We need to show up as real human beings with real experiences, with emotions, values, flaws, and a determination to act. And so what HLS gives us permission to really focus on is to invest the time that's needed to build meaningful relationships, to build trust. And we need to make sure that that is really intentional, not just a byproduct. It's about building a culture that is connected by a shared purpose and a shared sense of what are our values, how do we bring them to life, and that we can be authentic and that we can be flexible with the boundaries of our role. So this idea of head, heart, hands is one that is really important in that respect. The head being about how can we open our mind to challenge our own assumption and to learn. How can we be curious and ask ourselves questions like, why do we frame the problem the way that we do? What might we be missing? How might we be able to look at this differently? It's about opening the heart to be vulnerable and to deeply listen, to really hear the other person. So it's about being empathic. What values are important to us? Why do we care? And what matters to others in that respect as well? And thirdly, it's about opening the will to let go of preset goals and agendas and seeing what is really needed and possible. So to be brave and look for where is our agency to co-create a different future. Back to you.
When it comes to learning in terms of kind of systems based leadership, change is emergent and not predictable and constant when we're working in complexity. And so we know we need to have a reflexive, ongoing approach to learning for ourselves in kind of in terms of the previous slide and how we situate ourselves and how we learn individually, and also how we do that in our work with others. So that's practicing a cyclical learning approach, which I'm going to come back to on the next slide. Other things include developing rhythms and rituals for learning as part of the culture. So we saw in the examples of practice, some examples like, or some activities like an innovation nest to prototype and share learning, reflective supervision, other kinds of shared learning spaces. Really interesting to see the range of those across the projects. And it also means building insights and direction with those who have lived and kind of direct experience of the things that are the object of change. So some projects, some of those examples of practice have lived experience teams. Others have other ways of valuing that that knowledge, that expertise. So, for example, prioritizing team members coming out of communities with those experiences. And in terms of what it takes, there's evidence of having the space to kind of slow down and reflect, being prepared to be quote unquote wrong, and recognize the kind of limitations of our own perspectives, and then sharing learning across teams and organizations. So the learning cycle that I referenced on the previous slide is one that we use a lot. We use it, we ourselves and kind of suggest that other people can use it across scales, from thinking about a meeting. Well, what have we observed and interpreted, and what intervention have we tried in the context of something as small as a meeting to much bigger challenges. And this starts with questioning where we get is information and data from, kind of noticing and listening to the events and drawing patterns, to interpreting what we're observing, developing multiple hypotheses about why things are happening, making guesses, challenging ourselves to see many possibilities. Multiple things can be true. And then finally considering how to test a hypothesis, one among many that might be worth testing. And because it is a cycle, observing what happens after an intervention, what's going on now, having done that, what's the work that still needs to be done? How can we embed the learning? And you'll notice that if you are familiar with HLS literature, this bears some resemblance, but isn't exactly the same as one of the representations of a learning cycle, which is quite specific to a kind of programmatic application. This simple observe, interpret, intervene cycle is something that we can reflexively use anywhere at any time across kind of scales and contexts. But there is strong alignment between the two. And that brings us to systems. So systems in this context means understanding the systems that create outcomes we care about. So understanding that universe of planets, as we showed a few slides ago, disrupting and redistributing power across a system for greater equity. And at first glance, it might seem that building relationships and trust and disrupting and redistributing power are saying different things. But as Marshall Gans says, who's an organizer based in the US, now teaches and researches and writes about leadership at Harvard, power is not a thing you have. It's an influence created through interdependence. So power doesn't exist out there in some kind of finite bank. It's a product of our capacity to grow interdependence in a positive sense anyway. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about it also. Working across boundaries, amplifying marginalized voices, and negotiating through differences. And what it takes, we've seen, is adopting a holistic approach. So many of the examples of practice we looked at in advance of this session had to do with, or we're discussing putting people at the heart of services or support, moving away from having a patchwork of many different things that are not connected from each other, shifting from rigid eligibility-based service models to more flexible and relational ones, lots of things like that. It also takes getting buy-in, making space, and directing resources for innovation, and building capability and confidence through things like training, coaching, and support, especially for those with experience of the things that are the subject of the work and the staff working alongside them. Lots of examples in the examples of practice about those different models of training, coaching, and support. So with that, I'm gonna share the last slide, which is just to kind of anchor or is a culmination of everything. When we understanding the systems that that produce the outcomes we care about, and innovating needs to happen across a system in many directions. So within teams, between organizations, rather than in a simply vertical way, as is traditionally the case on the left-hand side. And so this brings everything together through learning as a strategy. Going to pass back to Gabriel to introduce Mike, our first speaker, and we'll subsequently hear from the other two speakers before we open up some breakout rooms for more meaningful discussions in smaller settings.
Exactly. And whilst we want you to actively listen to each of the speakers, we also have a little prompt question for you to be able to generate questions as we go along, so that we can take these into the breakout room conversations later on. So I'm delighted to introduce Mike, our first speaker. He leads Empowerment, which is an advocacy charity based in Blackpool. He's been on what he calls a painful journey from being a fully convinced adherent of new public management to discovering human learning systems and really embracing the joys of relational leadership and accepting that we're all messy, that we're all complex human beings. He argues that our systems, through constant learning, really need to reflect that humanity. And I think his leadership is really a great example that brilliant things can happen when we create a culture where everyone is accepted for who they are. So Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
So as Gabriel said, my name is Mike Crowther. I'm born and raised in Blackpool. And in the true spirit of being human and authentic leadership, I prepared nothing for this next 10 minutes. So this could either be absolutely sensational and inspirational, or I may be muted at some stage. But anyway, I think Gabriel, in terms of the introduction, has really summed up my journey. That I've gone from a point where actually I was an absolute solid adherent of new public management to embracing the joy, and it is the joy, and leadership should be enjoyable. That may be controversial, but the joy of human learning systems. So I'm 52. You didn't need to know that, and I'm sure you're all expressing shock and surprise that I am that age. But this year represents 30 years since I first came into the charitable and public sector. And it represents 20 years since I first got my first leadership position. So 30 years ago, I had no idea what I wanted to do in life. But I came across an advert for a local charity called Street Life to volunteer in their night shelter, working with young homeless people. So I got excited about that, and that's how I started. I had a very, very steep learning curve. I come from a very comfortable and privileged background, and then to actually meet real people who were actually just a few miles up the road from where I lived, going through the most direst of circumstances, really touched a nerve. And I got that passion, and the passion was to help other people, really. I then kind of got paid work and was part of teams supporting people who were homeless and people at risk of being homeless. And then in 2005, 20 years ago, I accidentally got into management. And up until then, I'd built a reputation of disliking with intensity anybody in a management or leadership position. They didn't know what they were doing. They were out of touch, overpaid, etc. I wasn't actually that far wrong about some of those things, but I became a manager, and the reason why is because our manager sadly passed away, and the rest of the team just ganged up on me and said, "You now have to be our manager." Okay, so that was my progression into leadership. This was at a time when there was something called the Supporting People programme, which some people may remember, but this was a huge government investment in services to support homeless people and those at risk of homelessness. But it came with it a very comprehensive programme of performance management and achieving outcomes. Okay. And I didn't really have any positive models for leadership. So I became this manager who had to be right, who didn't show any relatability or emotion. I made the decisions. And the one thing that was the most important aspect was to actually achieve the outcomes for which we'd been contracted for. And I was more bothered about staff not providing great support to people, but actually getting the paperwork done in time, getting it completed. And also in terms of, I would actually have conversations with staff who didn't get their assessments done in time for homeless people. Okay. And those would be sometimes disciplinary. You're not meeting your targets. I also absolutely was convinced that people with lived experience or ex-service users had no place whatsoever in service delivery, because people like me had all the answers. Put all of that into kind of being mega competitive. So it's about winning new contracts, winning new work, having, kind of building the empire of the organizations. And outwardly, I was hugely successful. But inwardly, I was quietly dying. Okay. And I think this is where the painful transition has to happen. So I bought into new public management. It was about the outcomes, didn't even stop to question where those outcomes came from. And we were forcing people into meeting those outcomes. I'd also say as well that that when we were completing those outcome returns, I was not truthful, because the most important aspect was to actually meet the targets that had been set for us. And if the reality of the world didn't meet those targets, we had to then fabricate those returns. Okay. That's the reality. And if I'm the only person that has done that, then I've just put myself in a very uncomfortable position, but I don't think I was. That's what the system did to us. Fast forward several years, and I'd become increasingly outwardly successful, but I was becoming increasingly unhappy. And therefore, things had to fall apart. And although I don't recommend falling apart, it can be helpful. Okay, so in about 2017-18, several things happened. I became so unhappy in my work that I left the job that I was doing because I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't put that mask on or fabricate who I was. I got so far from my values that I just couldn't do it anymore. I'd like to think that I had a very dramatic walking out. I didn't. I just quietly resigned, but with nothing to go to. The second thing is I finally admitted to myself and to others that I had depression and anxiety, and I'd hidden that for years. And I went from kind of not telling anybody, pretending that just life was difficult, to actually to the point where after treatment, and I'm still treated for depression and anxiety, I don't hide that. I still access talking therapies, and I also do a very poor impression of a professional runner in terms of trying to improve my physical well-being as well. So I accepted that that's part of me. It doesn't define me, but I have an underlying mental health condition. And as a leader, I don't care who knows that. The third aspect was that my marriage broke down as well. After years and years of putting the job first. Okay, it's a bit of a cliche, but I put the job first. And funnily enough, those people who love us actually do want to spend some time with us. They don't want to be that person who is second best, and that's what the situation. So it had to fall apart, and I didn't want to do leadership anymore. I wanted to go and work and stack shelves in a local supermarket. That seemed really favourable to me. But something miraculous then happened. Just as I was facing unemployment, homelessness, and a mental health condition, someone rang me to say there was this charity in Blackpool which was really struggling and about to go out of business. Would I mind kind of coming along just to see if we could do anything with the charity? And I was really reluctant because I didn't really want to do leadership anymore, but I did commit based on, well, actually I tried to play hard to get. They didn't know I had absolutely nothing lined up. So I agreed to lead this charity for 6 months. But I wanted to do something very different. I didn't have the mental well-being to pretend to be this alpha male leading organizations more. So I wanted to trust and work with others. I also met people with lived experience in the organization who did have lived experience of homelessness, of substance misuse, and they seemed to actually know quite a lot and be really good at what they did. And this was eye-opening to me because this kind of conflated everything I'd done. And I also wanted to kind of be the person who was excited again about genuinely listening to people, the reality of people's lives, rather than imposing a system on them, and trust. And at the same time, this is quite an amazing time of my life, really, but I also did some study encouraged by somebody else called an MA in social pedagogical leadership. Okay, so the words don't trip off the tongue, and Gabriel is a big proponent of social pedagogy, but this was mainly about leading through relationships, leading through authenticity, and learning to trust. And for the first time, I discovered a language which could articulate that there was no contradiction between being a leader and being passionate and setting the vision, but actually being deeply human as well. And over the years now, to the point where we've got with empowerment, is that I'm still a work in progress. This work never finishes. But over the last 12 months, we've just introduced a new collaborative leadership model. So there's all these incredible people who are actually taking the decisions and leading the organization forward. It just led me to think, well, actually, what is my role or purpose anymore? But actually, what it is to create an environment, create a culture in which those people can flourish. So we're still learning. I still get things wrong. This is not about perfection, but I have to say the human aspect of being a leader has transformed my life. And going back to what I said at the beginning, leadership actually has become enjoyable. I love leading because it's moved from that toxic model to one which is truly liberating. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. That's brilliant to hear. And we'll come back to lots of that in the breakout room, I'm sure. Lee?
Amazing. I think, yeah, Julian, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's really inspirational talk on your journey. Now I'm delighted to say we have Sally Kendrick today, and she's going to talk about her experience of learning and experimentation, drawing on her experience amongst other things from developing the family hubs in Plymouth, which was mentioned already by Gabrielle, was one of our HLS case studies. Sally has nearly 40 years of experience of working with children and families, moving between children's social care and in statutory social work in local authorities and across the voluntary and community sector, developing community-based family services. So her roles are included family work, leadership, service transformation and training and policy. Sally says it's been a privilege to have such a career working with communities, scaffolding connections, learning through lived experience and building on strengths. And that the older you get, you realise how little you know. So that was a quote from her grandmother, who Sally says was a keen learner, interested in people and continued to make new connections across her life and was an inspiration to her and her work. So over to you, Sally.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my slides. I have got a couple of slides, but there isn't lots of them. But thank you, Mike, for your real honest reflections, sharing your personal as well as your professional story. It really is helpful to combine that reality, isn't it, when we want to learn. Like Mike, it's really painful to look back over the roles where I was insistent on being a manager, and I don't know what I thought that was about, but it was really not about leading, and it definitely wasn't about human leading. It was about getting the job done, and I think those moments to look back on are quite painful, quite difficult to where we get to, but I'm still not there like you. So today I'm sharing my own personal reflections, my personal reflection. I'm just going to see if I can do this without my personal reflections. And I just wanted to say that today it's a really hard thing because you don't want it to be about yourself. It really is about the people that you work with. And I think that I'm nothing when I come to work without the people that help me to be myself within it. So it's a bit like the reflections when you sit on your own and write something to present today are really difficult because you're really only part of the system that you work within. What I would say is one of the things I've learned is that I get it wrong a lot. And one of the things I've learned is about having permission to say that. And in a way, that's freed me up being a leader in this space and hopefully frees up the people that I work with. Because I know I get it wrong, and I get it really wrong when I try to do it alone. So if I sit on my own and try and do it, I really get it wrong. So what I've done is try to set up, and the work that I was doing in Plymouth was really trying to set up this cycle that we've already heard from Lee about continual improvement and continual learning. It's almost like going through that journey, that cycle allows us to get better, to improve, to increase, to connect differently as we go through. So personally, I've been involved in change programs across different organisations and found myself at times overtaken by those targets, those performance-based responses, with limited time to reflect and think, and therefore limited time to learn. It is complex, it's really complicated, and it's really difficult. And the need to simplify sometimes traps me. So when I lose sight of the journey and focus only on the destination, I become transactional. And this limits my creativity and not only in myself, but in others. It stops that innovation, and you lose opportunities for clarity, for opportunities for collaboration. It reduces the thinking and the learning. So taking a learning approach, I feel I can be open to different perspectives. I can benefit from all who come with ideas for solutions. Taking a learning approach out allows me to hear the voice of the people that we support and the staff who are in touch every day with those families, building a culture where we're all curious and in learning mode. I've learned the hard way that the change journey with limited contacts and relationships, with disconnect from people, always ends with a new start. So in recent roles, I've tried to facilitate partnership approaches across different sectors within and with communities, and have had to find a different way. And the human learning system approach has allowed me to have a framework, not only to support the way I work and want to work, but also to describe and communicate to others about this. And that has allowed me to develop conditions alongside others for learning and building local support. So in my role with the family hubs, I was setting up one-stop shops for families, not personally, and this is the challenge, isn't it, when you're a leader, is you kind of feel like you're not out there doing it, you're relying on others to do it, and therefore it's about how you build that sense of collaboration across those teams and connect with the communities that you're serving and working for. So adopting that collaborative approach meant that we could bring together different parts of communities and systems and set a pattern for them to learn and develop as they go. One of the people that I met describes the family hubs development, and some of you will have experienced family hubs in your local authorities. They described it as building the plane as you flew it, which sounded terrifying to begin with when I was leading in that space. But what that did was it allowed us the opportunity to say, this is testing, this is learning, this is really a moment where we can wonder about what this looks like. We can build this as we go, and maybe we'll never get it right. Maybe there's always a modern design that we'll be working on. So getting on with the work and being prepared to get things wrong, twisting that around, building the insight from when we did that, taking feedback from all parts of the system, experimenting with ideas and building on innovation, being able to hear and support families appropriately in community required a consistency, not of service, but of a consistency of approach and a commitment to understand and hear what families were saying, building respectful curiosity and patience to hold back with a solution. One of the things that we found was a problem was that families were being slotted into services. And when we heard back from families, what they were saying is that they were kind of left with this complex system that they had to navigate, sometimes not really even understanding what they needed or what they could get from it. And yet we were putting pressure on them to sort it out for themselves. And on the other hand, we were setting up those services in the way we thought and the style we thought would work for them without actually communicating with them. So one of the things that was going on was lots of families were being pushed through an evidence-based family program of parenting. And what we were discovering is nobody'd really asked the question to begin with, or been curious enough before that journey to understand whether that was the right support for that family. So we'd have families on a program turning around and saying, one parent that I remember quite clearly saying, this is the 4th time I've done this parenting program, and another discovering that they were on a parenting program, but actually what they were after was a good night's sleep. You know, if we're curious, we find out something quite different about what people need. So the human learning approach was a useful way to start to think about how do we understand our communities better and actually lean in to be that one-stop shop, to be the space where we can connect and find the answers that families might give for themselves. The other thing we implemented in terms of an approach was the outcome star, and you'll see that in our case study, where we were looking at the way we join families on their own journey. not kind of decide where they're going to, but connect with where they want to be and connect with where they are now. So the outcome star was used alongside as well the Kolb cycle, which I'll just talk about in a little bit. But it was really important to highlight and build on the work. So that aside, there was some really brilliant stuff going on across communities. Quite often, those were the people who'd already established good relationships with the people living out and about across communities, struggling with challenges, is that some of those smaller organisations were really lost. Their voice was lost in the system. So it was about connecting those, building on that best practice, and really giving families the best opportunity to be contributing to the way that we were designing the services. So I'm going to draw to a close in a minute, but I just wanted to share another slide with you, which is the Kolb cycle. So just now we were talking about the way that cycles of learning really help us, and this is my go-to. I'm one of those people who in the past jumps from that, I know what needs to be done, I'm going to go straight into action, and that seems to be a problem within the whole system. So bringing in a cycle of learning has allowed us as a community, working with communities and working with families, to really stop and take our time, to model curiosity, to really start to understand and get under the skin of what's happening within a community, but also within individual families. And that allows us to build on the conversations, to build on the relationships, to build on the insight before we begin to decide what are the problems and what needs solutions. Those solutions have to be done together. What we created around this was another model which allowed us to stop and check different steps. And what you'll see is that attach, attune, assess and analyse were all about getting to know you. There's a different journey of getting to know families, and we set in place this idea of a family tells us their story, and their story is told to us before we start to act and before we start to respond to their needs. And culturally, that became a really good way to experiment in new ways. So what happened then was we were able to work with families to set up their own services. We had dads involved in running their own forums. We had communities involved in setting up a new service for themselves in the way that would bring other families together to learn together. We were able to put in place food for families living in temporary housing, because we had ideas that from the college that they wanted to provide to help out in their community. So we're able to connect people together. So the College of Students Learning Catering were cooking for families in situations where they couldn't cook. So we started to build this kind of culture and then reflect and learn when it went wrong. So sorry, I know I've run out of time and I've got plenty more to say. So I'll just stop there and say continued learning's the thing. The project's gone on from strength to strength. It's about setting that way, I think, and not about leading it through to the next step.
Thanks so much. So yeah, recognize that you ran out of time there, but we've fortunately got some breakouts to continue the conversation. And Diana, your slides are up now. I'm just going to say a word about Diana, our third speaker. So Diana leads the Transformational Change Division within Healthcare Improvement Scotland, which covers mental health, drugs, and alcohol through a kind of systems change bend. Diana has experience working in systems of care, has led the development of approaches to transforming quality of care through bringing together multiple methods with a focus on understanding a complex system with those who need, use, and deliver care. And she's previously led at Scotland and UK level levels, designing and developing service models in palliative care and humanitarian support, including in Ukraine and Nigeria. So Diana, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me today. I've been really enjoying the presentations as well. Lots for me to take away. So I'm here to talk about what leadership looks like in Scotland. The role of Healthcare Improvement Scotland is to support health and social care organisations to deliver quality of care for the people in Scotland. And part of that quality is really understanding what quality means for people. We also know that we're against a backdrop, and I'm aware for those in NHS, for those in England, that the challenges for the NHS there are quite front and centre at the minute. But in Scotland, we similarly have our own challenges. We have an unsustainable health and social care system with increased demand, particularly challenging for those people who are marginalised or facing financial challenges are really difficult. And so how do we use our policy space in Scotland with things like value-based health and care and realistic medicine and the Christie Commission to really renew our health and social care system with people right at the centre? One of the things that we recognised was that there are multiple methods for change, and actually those methods began competing with each other. So there are people who are vehemently passionate about a service design approach, and there are people who are vehemently passionate about a quality improvement approach, and there are people who are vehemently passionate about Lean and Six Sigma and these things as a way of getting quality. And over the last 6 years, we've been also doing a lot of work with the Human-Learning-Systems approach. And what we recognise, all the people who are trying to get to the same goal of really person-centred practice that makes a difference for people and trying to lead that, we're getting stuck in this battle of the methodologies, and we're being dragged around different bits of theory and different clubs. And that actually what we needed was a really practical approach to change that brought out the best of these, because actually at the heart, they are quite similar. If you actually take any organisation, any person, from somebody who's delivering services directly with people, a social worker or a district nurse, to somebody who's managing a health board of 1.2 million people. And actually the fact that we've got circles and all the diagrams today have had circles probably says a lot about what we're doing, and they have learning at their heart. So when we think about quality, and I can put a link in when I finish talking to the website that can take you through this, but what we recognised and really sort of came out of our experience of doing Human Learning Systems alongside our quality improvement colleagues was that learning bit at the centre. And that planning for quality doesn't mean like a management job of planning for quality, but to really take the time and pay attention to what quality looks like for the people that you are trying to serve. And to do that with those interconnected learning systems at the Human Learning System. So the kind of experience that Sally is talking about there, that experience of what's happening for people directly can be how an organisation works. And when we do that, we recognise there were some essentials that were really important in that change. And that resonates with your conversation about that move from new public management into something that really matters. So what we recognised and was that all of these things, you have to change them all. You have to and for leadership to actually recognise that how the good stuff's in the dull stuff, as I often say, that how you do data management, how you do your commissioning, your governance, your finance, is as important as how you do your learning, that they all have to have people at the heart, but they all have to have rigour. But that rigour isn't assuring yourself of false targets. That rigour is making sure that you are taking that learning that is happening. And I love that model that you shared, like learning that happens like that. How does that change the business of the organisation? So when we did some work with homelessness and addiction, we recognised that through a period of understanding what the addictions team were doing, they were getting TV aerials for people. Because what people were struggling with was actually they were being rehoused. They were alone in their housing. They are trying to distract themselves from wanting to go and get a drink, and they couldn't watch TV because they didn't have a TV aerial. The only people they trusted was their addictions counsellor. So that's where they went. Now, the addiction service wasn't set up to give out TV aerials, so like there was a mismatch. But instead of saying that's a problem and actually redirecting people to the right people, the organisation was able to make a change to say we need to work more closely with our housing colleagues to facilitate and enable this what is important around an individual. And that comes through data and measurement, the tools that we were using. We did a demand analysis tool, which can be used to really beat a system down with performance management, but use it with curiosity, exactly that word. Used with curiosity, the system was able to change. So we understand, we've done a whole lot of literature. The Audit Scotland said, there's all these change initiatives in Scotland and none of them are sticking and we're still not getting. I always talk about, Christie was written 10 odd years ago and the Christie Commission in Scotland said we need more community-based, more collaborative, community empowered ways of working if we're going to have a sustainable quality of life for people in Scotland. We know that Reshaping Care for Older People 10 years ago said a very similar thing. You need to radically rethink and rebalance to community-based, person-centred systems if we are to get an NHS out of crisis. And we didn't do either of those things. We tried lots, but we haven't achieved it. And oh, look, we've got an NHS in crisis and a lack of quality of care. So what are we learning? So we're learning that when people don't feel listened to and they don't feel empowered, when we have these hierarchical command and controls and that performance culture, that is what the evidence is saying. So we have now published this evidence in Scotland to government to say, this is what will make change fail. So from the top of that leadership at government level, we are saying this we need to shift away from in our approach. We know that we need enabling leadership. So if you go on our Scottish approach to change, which is the approach that we're going to use for NHS renewal, under the section on leadership, it talks about that leadership need to be courageous and compassionate. They need to actively remove barriers that are across the silos, and that they need to build a will for change. But what we've also noticed, and this is a sort of new thinking, so I'm particularly keen to discuss this in the breakout groups in my last minutes, to leave you with a thing that we often focus about leaders at the top of the pile, the chief exec, the chair, the whoever who's at the top of the pile, and we teach them what they need to do for leadership. There is a type of leadership called the system diplomat leader. And they are the leader that is unseen, often unspoken. They can have different jobs, but they are, by God, the person who makes a thing happen. And I can tell you, if I go back to every single one of these projects that's been a success, that is Morag in North Lanark. She was the head of service. In Aberdeen, it's the public health, it's the head of public health. They are the person who people trust across the system. They are the people are attentive to across the system. They build alliances, they mediate, they influence, and they combine that knowledge and skill. And our job, I would say, to senior leaders is to find them, no matter what change you are doing, work out who they are and enable the absolute out of them. Because they're the people, not the person at the top, that will make this work. Because when I've tried to do change with the most inspiring leaders, and there wasn't one of them, it has failed. So that's it. I'd love to talk to you more about that when we get into our discussion group. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Diana. It's wonderful note to leave people on, a bit of a carrot for the breakout. So we are going to have about 15-20 minutes worth of breakout discussions. Grace is going to open them in just a moment. So Grace, you can say a word about that. But I first just want to say no obligation to speak in the breakout room. If you really object to being in it, you are more than welcome to come back at about 1:20 for the kind of roundup to hear what some of those conversations were like and how and what support is available around leadership from our organizations hosting the event. So Grace, do you want to say a word about the breakouts?
Yes, so we're going to have 3 breakout rooms and they'll be named after each of the speakers, and you should be able to choose which room to join. It should be that simple. I'm going to open them now, and yes, we'll have until about 1:20 in the breakout rooms, I think.
starting with the group that I was part of in Mike's group, one of the key things I took away was just the joy of leadership. And Mike talked about it comes from not having to pretend anymore, from not feeling like I have to wear a mask, and just accepting the support that is needed to show up as a real human being, to be vulnerable, to accept that we are all flawed human beings. And the joy also comes from seeing others become great leaders, kind of taking those cues and really kind of showing up in ways that are authentic, recognizing that we actually all need each other. It's so much better when we're all coming together. So thank you so much, Mike. Julian, over to you. What's one thing you're taking away from your group?
I think there's the reflection at the end is about really listening and how you do that, ways of opening up that listening space and challenging your own assumptions, particularly within communities. And there were some nice examples talked about with the using tools like the open appreciative inquiry method, which allows people to tell their narrative, their story about how they feel about their lives and contextualize that, which can be and the real power of that, the narrative power of actually stories to changing our assumptions in our minds. And then also the other one that Sally mentioned, which was also the outcome star, I think she mentioned the presentation, which was also quite a powerful tool which enabled people, facilitated the conversation with practitioners, and they found it really useful to kind of help instigate the cultural change they needed to do. So that was a sort of an instrument which could help them become more learning as a team. So I think that was really important. And there were just a few other things around sort of like negotiating the existing system, really around KPIs and how you have to sort of work around the system and create the space, but it doesn't necessarily need more resources to do that. There's quite a lot going on already that you can start somewhere and build on.
And I'll share something from the group with Diana. So we kind of continued the conversation about diplomats, and there were some other similar offerings, such as the phrase tempered radicals. One thing I'm taking away is the phrase from Hamish, codified common sense, that this is codified common sense. And Diana was talking about an evidence base, bringing rigor, which feels like that codification bit, and that it's also important that we talk about power in a bit more of a nuanced way, not as in giving up power, which also reinforces that point that power is like a bank, that I was trying to kind of debunk earlier, but rather as something that is a bit more complicated, and that rather than kind of stepping out of your power, really recognizing your power, working with your power, building power is more the name of the game. So that's the final group. I'm gonna pass it over to Elle from the Collaborate team, who's been floating a bit, who's gonna offer some final reflections and share a bit about what Collaborate can offer in the way of support in this area.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks all. It's been fantastic to listen both to the speakers and to your groups. I kind of floated between the 3.5 groups as there were in the end, as there was a great little conversation happening in the main room too. And I was prompted by our first speaker to think about what is it that prompts people to take acts of leadership. In some sense, it requires courage. It sounds like it can invoke joy, but it's not something that everybody is doing every day. And I have heard in our conversations things that come from our personal experience, a sense of things being less than they could be, perhaps evidence of injustice, that it comes from a sense of values misalignment, that we're feeling out of kilter with the way things are at present, or that we're seeing things through a new lens, and that in some senses HLS has given people that new lens through which to notice that the way things are doesn't need to be the way things continue to be. So I was thinking about those as kind of what might move us to enact these practices of leadership. And then I was thinking about the types of leadership that we've heard described here, and there's been reference to system stewardship and system diplomats and various other like uses of leadership, I suppose. And I think there's something really important about our capacity to shape the way that we show up as leaders, as ourselves, but in context and in trying to move something, to make progress on something that matters to us and to people around us. And we've heard sometimes that's about exposing fault lines in the current system. Sometimes that's about creating space and time to attend to what's important and allow innovation. And sometimes that's about putting in place the conditions that this new way of being requires of us, bringing about that alternative culture. And I'm struck by how kind of similar and different those modes of leadership might be, and the different ways in which the context of the system that we're operating in might call different parts of us forward in that role of leadership. And then finally, as I touched on briefly, I've heard reference to the value of HLS itself as a framework, as a tool of leadership, connecting to people who might have been sort of thinking things like this, but not had a way of codifying it, of explaining a possible alternative direction, an alternate future, and as advocating for something different, all of which are acts of leadership in and of themselves. So if this conversation has sparked your interest and curiosity, all of the folks who've been involved in presenting today are part of the HLS Collaborative, which is a consortium of different organisations putting this work into practice across the country, but also learning from each other about what works well and how and why. So if you've got examples and case studies to share, please do get in touch. We'd always like to learn from you also. And then all of our organisations also offer support through consultancy, through training, through standing alongside you as learning partners to help you put this work into practice. Collaborate has done a number of different kind of formal learning and training programs for people in the voluntary sector and in public services. So if you feel like your local public services could do with some support to change the way they're operating, do put them in touch with us. And I'm sure there's other things that other colleagues can offer too. So do get in touch if there's ever anything that we can do to help. Gabriel, over to you.
Absolutely, thanks, Elle. Yes, the HLS world is a really vibrant community. It keeps growing. So make sure that you come along to any opportunities to kind of really connect and learn with and from each other. If this inspires you to go on a more personal journey of developing your relational leadership qualities, then we do have a course as well on that. So as Elle was saying, there's a whole range of different ways in which you can get supported and feel like actually you're not on this journey on your own. You have these kinds of allies that make it worth its while and that help you find the joy in it. So I'd like to just thank Mike and Sally and Diana again for their brilliant contributions, really inspiring stuff. I'd like to thank all of you for coming along and for your exciting contributions and questions and ideas that you brought. And of course, I'd like to thank my colleagues at Collaborate and Julian at Plymouth University as well for joining us in this webinar. So thank you ever so much. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday afternoon, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.